In the final years of the Second World War, Germany believed it had solved one of the most dangerous problems in modern air combat. Fighting at night, British bombers crossed Europe after sunset, invisible to the naked eye, protected by darkness and altitude. Early in the war, German air defenses struggled to respond. Pilots searched blindly. Interceptors missed targets by kilometers. Entire formations passed through the night untouched. But then Germany built something new. A system. Radar stations detected incoming bombers. Ground controllers tracked them on glowing screens. Radio operators guided night fighters through the darkness, vectoring them directly onto enemy aircraft. For the first time, German pilots could see without seeing. By 1942, the system appeared unstoppable. Bomber losses increased sharply. British crews spoke of invisible enemies rising from the dark, attacking without warning, then vanishing again. Entire bomber streams were broken apart by fighters that seemed to know exactly where to be. From Berlin, the night war looked under control. But beneath that confidence, something fragile had begun to form, because the entire system depended on one thing: signals. Every interception relied on radio transmissions. Every vector relied on spoken instructions. Every correction relied on a constant stream of guidance flowing from the ground to the aircraft. German night fighters were not hunting freely. They were being guided. The pilots trusted the voices in their headsets. The voices trusted the radar operators. The operators trusted the system. And the system trusted that no one else was listening. That trust would prove fatal. At first, there was no sign of danger. Night fighter operations continued to improve. Tactics evolved. Procedures were refined. Germany invested heavily in radar technology and control networks. The Luftwaffe believed it had achieved technological superiority in the night sky. British bombers kept coming. But something about the interceptions began to change. RAF crews noticed that German fighters were appearing with uncanny consistency, not just near targets, but along predictable corridors. Sometimes they arrived too perfectly, turning in exactly the right direction at exactly the right time. This was not pilot intuition. This was guidance. And guidance meant signals. Inside British intelligence, analysts were watching closely. They were not looking at radar screens or aircraft silhouettes. They were listening to the air itself. Every night, fighter interception generated radio traffic. Ground stations spoke to pilots. Pilots acknowledged instructions. Corrections were issued. Headings were adjusted. To German command, these transmissions were essential. To the Allies, they were opportunities. At first, the signals seemed chaotic. Too many voices, too much movement, too little structure. But intelligence work is patient. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain frequencies appeared only during interceptions. Certain phrases preceded attacks. Certain transmission rhythms corresponded with successful kills. The Allies began to realize something unsettling. German night fighters were not autonomous. They were dependent. The more the system succeeded, the more it spoke. And the more it spoke, the more it revealed. By 1943, British scientists and intelligence officers were asking a dangerous question. What if the German night fighter system could be attacked without destroying a single aircraft? What if it could be confused instead of confronted? What if the strength of the system its coordination could be turned into a weakness. At this stage, nothing was obvious. Germany still dominated the night skies. Losses were real. The system still worked. But intelligence does not wait for collapse. It looks for leverage. The British began experimenting quietly, not with bombs or guns, but with signals, with interference, with timing, with subtle distortions that would not immediately reveal themselves. The goal was not to shut the system down. That would be noticed. The goal was to make it unreliable, to introduce doubt, to make pilots question their guidance without knowing why. The challenge was immense. German night fighters were trained to trust their instruments absolutely. Radar operators were disciplined. Procedures were strict. Any obvious interference would be detected and corrected. So the Allies did something more dangerous. They blended in. They studied German radio behavior until it could be predicted. They learned how instructions were phrased, how vectors were issued, how corrections sounded when delivered by ground control. They did not need to speak German fluently. They needed to sound German enough. Slowly, almost invisibly, Allied planners began testing the edges of the system. Small disruptions, slight delays, signals that arrived just a moment too late or slightly out of phase. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be reported as an attack, but enough to create hesitation. A pilot who turned a few degrees off course. A fighter that arrived seconds too late. A radar contact that no longer aligned perfectly with instructions. At first, German command blamed human error, then weather, then fatigue. The system was still trusted, but cracks were forming. And once a pilot doubts his guidance in the dark, fear takes over faster than logic. Germany still believed it controlled the night. It did not yet understand that the night was beginning to listen back. To understand why the German night fighter force was so vulnerable, it is necessary to understand how it actually worked. German pilots were not hunting in the dark. They were being directed. At the heart of the system stood ground control. Radar stations spread across occupied Europe scanned the skies continuously, tracking Allied bomber streams as they crossed the coast and moved inland. These radar plots were fed into centralized command rooms, where controllers followed dozens of aircraft at once. From there, instructions flowed outward. Controllers assigned specific night fighters to specific targets. They calculated headings, altitudes, speeds. Pilots received constant updates through their headsets, adjusting course in real time as bombers maneuvered below. The fighter did not search for the enemy. The enemy was delivered to the fighter. This approach had enormous advantages. German pilots did not waste fuel or time wandering blindly. Interceptions were efficient. Losses were inflicted quickly. For a time, it gave Germany a decisive edge, but it also created absolute dependence. A pilot without radio guidance was effectively blind. Onboard radar existed, but it was limited in range and reliability. It was meant to confirm a target, not find one. Without instructions from the ground, many night fighters could not locate bombers at all. This was not a flaw. It was a design choice. German doctrine valued centralized control. Decisions were made on the ground, where information was pooled and coordinated. Pilots were executors, not independent hunters. As long as the system functioned, this approach worked. The problem was that the system could not function silently. Each interception required dozens of transmissions, headings, corrections, Acknowledgements, confirmations. The radio channels were busy, structured, and predictable. And predictability is deadly in intelligence warfare. British analysts listening to the airwaves began to realize that German night fighter control followed strict routines. Interceptions unfolded in recognizable phases. Certain phrases were always used before an attack. Certain frequencies became active only when fighters were close to their targets. This was not chaos. It was choreography. The British did not need to know which bomber was being targeted. They only needed to know when and where guidance was occurring. That alone revealed enough. More importantly, it revealed something else. German pilots trusted their radios completely. In darkness, with no visual reference and limited instruments, the voice from the ground became authority itself. Pilots followed instructions instinctively, even when they felt uncertain. The radio did not suggest, it commanded. This psychological dependence would become the system's greatest weakness. Because when guidance fails, the pilot does not simply continue. He hesitates. By mid 1943, Allied planners understood that destroying radar stations was not enough. Stations could be rebuilt. Frequencies could be changed. Operators could adapt. What mattered was the relationship between pilot and guidance. If that relationship could be broken, even temporarily, the system would collapse on its own. But breaking it directly would alert German command immediately. So the Allies chose a more subtle path. They would interfere just enough to create doubt. British scientists began studying the timing of German transmissions, how quickly instructions followed radar detections, how often pilots acknowledged commands, how long it took for corrections to be issued. They were not trying to block signals. They were trying to bend them. The goal was to introduce errors that looked natural. A slight delay here, a momentary overlap there, a correction that arrived just late enough to be useless. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Pilots encountering these issues did not report sabotage. They reported confusion, a vector that didn't quite line up, a target that wasn't where it should have been, an interception that failed for reasons no one could explain. German command responded as expected. They blamed training. They blamed fatigue. They blamed weather. They did not suspect manipulation. After all, the radios were working. Messages were being sent and received. Frequencies were clear. Equipment appeared functional. From a technical standpoint, nothing was broken. But operationally, something was slipping. As these small disruptions accumulated, pilots began to hesitate. When instructions conflicted with instinct, they paused. When targets failed to appear where expected, confidence eroded. In daylight, a pilot can correct visually. At night, doubt is dangerous. The system had been designed for certainty. Now it was producing uncertainty. German command attempted minor adjustments. Procedures were refined. Controllers were reminded to be precise. Pilots were urged to trust guidance fully. The system was tightened, which made it easier to predict. By late 1943, Allied planners believed they were ready to move beyond testing. They had learned the structure. They understood the habits. They knew when German night fighters would listen most closely, and they knew exactly when a single signal could cause maximum disruption. What they were about to do would not blind the system immediately. It would do something worse. It would turn the system against itself. The Allied breakthrough did not come in the form of a dramatic new weapon. There was no explosion, no sudden blackout, no obvious attack on German radar stations. Instead, it arrived quietly, and that was precisely why it worked. By late 1943, British planners understood something fundamental about the German night fighter system. It was not resilient. It was precise, and precision, when disrupted even slightly, collapses faster than brute force. The system did not tolerate ambiguity. German night fighters relied on continuous guidance. Headings had to arrive on time. Corrections had to be accurate. Delays were not just inconvenient, they were destabilizing. The Allies decided to exploit that sensitivity. They did not attempt to jam German frequencies outright. Heavy jamming would have been noticed immediately. Controllers would have switch channels. Procedures would have been altered. Instead, the Allies chose deception over denial. Specialized units began transmitting signals designed to interfere not with reception, but with timing. The objective was simple: arrive just late enough to be believed. Allied transmitters mimicked the characteristics of German ground control signals. Power levels were carefully matched. Signal shapes were studied. Transmission timing was aligned with known interception phases. The false signals did not override German commands. They shadowed them. A pilot would receive an instruction from his controller, and then, moments later, receive something that sounded almost identical, but slightly out of sequence. Not contradictory, just confusing. In the darkness, with only a headset and instruments for reference, the difference was devastating. Pilots hesitated. Which instruction was correct? Which heading should be followed? Was the second transmission an update or interference? There was no time to ask. Seconds mattered. A fighter that hesitated missed its window. A correction taken too late sent the aircraft drifting into empty sky. Bombers passed unchallenged. At first, these incidents were isolated. A missed interception here, a delayed attack there. German command noticed, but not alarmingly so. Failures happened even in well-functioning systems. No single report suggested sabotage, but patterns were forming. Pilots began reporting guidance that felt uncertain, instructions that arrived too late, corrections that contradicted expectations without clearly opposing them. Crucially, the radios were still clear. There was no static, no obvious jamming, no signal loss. Everything sounded normal. That was the genius of the approach. The Allies were not blinding German night fighters. They were misleading them. As confidence eroded, pilots began to second-guess instructions. Some followed the first command they heard. Others waited for confirmation that never came. A few attempted to rely on onboard radar alone, with limited success. The system had been designed around trust. Now trust was becoming a liability. German command attempted to respond. Controllers were instructed to speak more clearly. Pilots were reminded to follow procedures strictly. Technical checks were conducted on radio equipment. Nothing appeared wrong. From a technical perspective, the system functioned perfectly, which made the failures harder to explain. By early 1944, the disruption intensified. Allied planners refined their timing. Signals became more precisely synchronized with German transmissions. False guidance arrived at the worst possible moments, just before intercept, just after correction, just as pilots committed to an attack. Night fighters began to wander. Some turned away from targets they were seconds from reaching. Others arrived too late to engage. A few found themselves dangerously close to friendly aircraft, having followed guidance that no longer matched reality. Pilots described a growing sense of unease. The radio, once a source of certainty, now introduced doubt. And in the night, doubt is paralyzing. Bomber losses began to decline, not dramatically at first, gradually, quietly. From the British perspective, this was exactly what they wanted. Sudden improvement would draw attention. A slow shift could be attributed to chance. German command searched for explanations. Fatigue increased as bomber streams grew larger. Weather conditions worsened. Allied countermeasures were blamed. The possibility of radio deception remained unspoken. After all, the signals sounded German. The tone was right. The phrasing was familiar. The timing was plausible. No obvious enemy was present. By the time German commanders began to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong, the damage had already been done. Pilots no longer trusted guidance implicitly, and without trust, the system could not function. Night fighters were still flying. Radars were still operating. Controllers were still issuing commands. But the chain that linked them together had weakened. The Allies had not destroyed the system. They had hollowed it out from within. The consequences of Allied interference did not appear all at once. They accumulated. At first, German night fighter losses were not dramatic. Aircraft still returned to base. Pilots still reported interceptions. The system appeared functional, at least on paper. But something fundamental had changed. Night fighters were arriving late. Targets were slipping away. Interceptions failed at the final moment. Pilots began reporting missions where nothing made sense. Instructions arrived that conflicted subtly with expectation. A heading adjustment came seconds too late. An altitude correction sent the fighter beneath a bomber that should have been directly ahead. These were not catastrophic failures. They were worse. They were confusing failures. In the darkness, without visual reference, a pilot depends on certainty. Once that certainty disappears, hesitation replaces instinct. Some pilots began delaying responses, waiting for confirmation that never came. Others attempted to compensate manually, relying more heavily on onboard radar or intuition. Neither approach worked well. Onboard radar lacked range and clarity. Intuition is unreliable at night. Fighters drifted off course, burned fuel unnecessarily, or returned to base without ever seeing the enemy. Meanwhile, Allied bombers continued their missions. The change was subtle, but measurable. Bomber losses declined. Sortie success rates increased. German interception effectiveness dropped. Inside German command, concern grew. Radar operators insisted their plots were accurate. Controllers insisted instructions were clear. Pilots insisted guidance had become unreliable. Each group blamed the others. No single failure could be isolated. That was the problem. German command attempted corrective action. Procedures were standardized again. Radio discipline was emphasized. Controllers were instructed to reduce unnecessary transmissions and issue clearer vectors. Ironically, these changes made the system more predictable. Allied intelligence adapted immediately. The same rigid structure that once gave German night fighters an advantage now worked against them. Once procedures were tightened, Allied operators knew exactly when guidance would be issued and when false signals would have the greatest effect. Night after night, pilots encountered the same uncertainty. Some reported receiving guidance that felt almost right. Others described moments when two instructions seemed to overlap, neither fully dominant. In a few cases, pilots followed guidance that led them dangerously close to friendly aircraft or into heavily defended airspace. Trust eroded further. As confidence in radio guidance declined, pilot behavior changed. Some became overly cautious, breaking off intercepts prematurely. Others grew aggressive, pressing attacks without proper positioning. Both approaches increased risk. Losses mounted, not because German fighters were being shot down more frequently, but because they were being misdirected, exhausted, and placed in dangerous situations. By early 1944, the system was visibly strained. German command faced an uncomfortable reality. The night fighter network still existed. Radar stations still operated. Radios still functioned. But coordination was breaking down. The system had been designed to operate as a single organism. When one element failed, the others compensated. Now, multiple elements were failing quietly, simultaneously. German attempt to counter the interference intensified. Technical teams searched for jamming sources. Frequencies were shifted. Equipment was recalibrated. Nothing changed. There was no obvious enemy signal to eliminate. Because the interference did not look like an attack. It looked like error. The most dangerous kind of failure is the one that cannot be identified. Pilots began to express fear, not of Allied fighters, but of their own guidance. Missions became psychologically exhausting. The radio, once a lifeline, became a source of anxiety. Every instruction was questioned. Every correction doubted. The system no longer inspired confidence. And without confidence, discipline collapses. By mid-1944, German night fighters were no longer shaping the air war. They were reacting to it. Interceptions became rare. Bomber streams penetrated deeper into Germany with fewer losses. The Allies had not destroyed the night fighter force. They had neutralized it, all without firing a shot at the system itself. German command was forced to confront the truth. The problem was not technical. It was structural. The night fighter system had been built around centralized control and absolute trust in radio guidance. Once that trust was compromised, no procedural fix could restore it. The system had become fragile, and fragility spreads. By the time German leadership fully understood what had happened, options were limited. New tactics required retraining. New systems required time Germany no longer had. The night war was slipping away, and the realization came with a bitter understanding. The Allies had not blinded German night fighters overnight. They had made them doubt, slowly, relentlessly. And doubt in the dark is deadly. By the summer of 1944, German night fighters were still taking off. Aircraft still climbed into the darkness. Pilots still wore headsets. Ground controllers still spoke into microphones. From the outside, the system appeared intact. But in reality, it was already finished. The Allied deception had done its work, not by destroying radar stations, not by silencing radios, not by overwhelming the system with noise, but by removing certainty. German command searched desperately for a technical explanation. Frequencies were changed again. Equipment was inspected repeatedly. Engineers found nothing that justified the collapse in effectiveness. Because the failure was no longer technical, it was human. Pilots no longer trusted what they heard. Controllers no longer trusted pilot reports. Radar operators no longer trusted the results of interceptions. The chain of confidence that once bound the system together had fractured, and once fractured, it could not be repaired quickly enough. Attempts were made to decentralize control. Some pilots were encouraged to operate more independently. Others were instructed to rely more heavily on onboard radar. These changes came too late. German night fighters had been trained for years to depend on guidance. Independence required a mindset that could not be improvised under combat conditions. Onboard radar was never designed to replace ground control. It was an aid, not a solution. The system had evolved in one direction. Turning it around in the middle of a war was impossible. Meanwhile, Allied bombers continued to fly deeper into German airspace with increasing confidence. Losses still occurred, but nothing like the level seen when the night fighter system was at its peak. From the Allied perspective, the success was almost invisible. There was no single moment of victory, no dramatica non cement, no clear sign that the system had been defeated. It simply stopped working. And that was the most dangerous outcome of all. German command never received definitive proof of what had happened. There was no captured document, no intercepted confession, no obvious enemy transmission to point to. The Allies had not announced their presence. They had disappeared back into the noise. Only after the war did the full picture begin to emerge. Analysis of Allied intelligence records revealed how carefully the deception had been constructed, how precise the timing had been, how deliberately uncertainty had been introduced. The goal had never been to overpower the system. It had been to undermine it. German night fighters were not defeated by superior aircraft or better pilots alone. They were defeated by a loss of trust. Trust in guidance. Trust in coordination. Trust in the unseen voices that once gave meaning to the darkness. This was the true power of intelligence warfare. Not destruction, but manipulation. The Allied signal that disrupted the German night fighter system did not blind pilots instantly. It made them hesitate. It made them doubt. And in the dark, hesitation is fatal. By the time Germany understood that its night fighters were no longer truly guided, the strategic situation had already shifted. The air war was no longer about interception. It was about endurance. And Germany no longer had the advantage. The story of the night fighters is not a story of technology alone. It is a story of systems, and how systems fail when they are too precise, too rigid, too dependent on trust. Germany built a network that worked brilliantly until someone learned how to speak its language. The Allies did not need to shout. They whispered, and the system listened until it could no longer tell the difference between truth and deception.